Colonel Doug Macgregor, virtually alone among American military analysts, understood the potential consequences of this war the very first day, the day it started. He was attacked for that. We're honored to have him join us tonight. Doug Macgregor, thanks so much for coming on. If Zelensky is demanding that we preemptively nuke Russia, you would expect someone in Washington to say, whoa, 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 that's crazy talk. But I don't hear anyone saying that.
Well, there are a couple of things at work. First of all, almost from the very first moment that the Russians moved into eastern Ukraine, a succession of retired generals and political hacks in Washington and London and elsewhere have been declaring imminent victory for Ukraine. 7 months later, and the Ukrainian army is bled white. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops have been killed or wounded. Ukraine is really on the ropes and trying to create the illusion that that's not the case. At the same time, Vladimir Putin has finally concluded that he can't negotiate with Kyiv, that the real problem is, of course, Washington, and that Washington will not negotiate with him. So he's opted for partial mobilization, bringing in additional forces, ostensibly for the purpose of ending this thing. And at the same time, he's very aware, as any of us are who are in the defense community in Washington, that there's been a lot of loose talk for several months about the viability of waging a limited nuclear war against Russia using the so-called tactical nuclear weapon. And this sort of thing is very frightening to the Russians. They've made it very clear that their use of nuclear weapons is limited to retaliatory strikes in the event that we or someone else strikes them. So they just wanted to reaffirm clearly that they will respond if we use a nuclear weapon.
I just, in one sentence, tell me, you've been in Washington and in the U.S. Army for all your life. People didn't used to talk like this. Let's just throw nukes at a country. I mean, when did this start?
I think we've always had a certain number of people who believed in the viability of a limited nuclear war, but normally they were beaten back into the background and regarded as, quite frankly, crazy. But they are in ascendance. Yeah. And they have gained a lot of credibility.
It's shocking that people who don't pay attention to this stuff every day. It really is the most reckless thing I can imagine. Colonel Doug Macgregor, thank you so much for coming on tonight.
Welcome back. So it has been 7 months since the war between Russia and Ukraine broke out, and it appears there is no peace deal in sight. Nobody wants to talk about peace, whether it's America or anybody in the United Nations, obviously the two parties involved. Why not? Why wouldn't you want to seek peace? How long is it going to last? On Wednesday, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordering Russia's first full mobilization since World War II. He went on to warn the West that he says, I'm not bluffing. He said he is ready to possibly use nuclear weapons to defend Russia. Putin also explicitly raised the specter of nuclear conflict, proving a plan to annex a chunk of Ukraine the size of Hungary. He also called up 300,000 reservists. He cited the expansion of NATO towards Russia's border for his reasoning of threatening the use of nuclear weapons. Putin said, quote, the West is plotting to destroy my country and engaging in nuclear blackmail by allegedly discussing the potential use of weapons against Moscow. He then accused the U.S., the European Union, and Britain of encouraging Ukraine to push military operations into Russia. Our next guest, Colonel Doug Macgregor, recently wrote an article, gave his thoughts and opinion about the war between Ukraine and Russia. He says that the Ukrainian President Zelensky has also adopted a strategy of holding ground in eastern Ukraine. This strategy was used on the German military at the end of 1942 during World War II. Colonel goes on to say Ukrainian forces immobilized themselves inside urban areas and as a result turned urban centers into fortifications. Says that the Ukrainian forces are bleeding to death in counterattack after counterattack. I want to bring the Colonel on the program now and get his thoughts on what's happening 7 months into this war. I want to welcome Colonel Macgregor, of course, former advisory to the SecDef under President Trump. Colonel, how about it? That's some pretty big threats, some pretty big accusations that Putin's throwing out there. What have you heard? Has the UN and America and Britain all been colluding behind the scenes saying we might use nukes in Moscow, or is this just Putin being Putin?
No, I'm afraid that there's been some very serious talk behind the scenes in the Department of Defense and the White House and even some people on the Hill regarding the use of what we call tactical nuclear weapons against the Russians in Ukraine. And of course, that is unacceptable under any circumstances to the Russians. What the Russians have restated is essentially their foreign policy position, which is that nuclear weapons will only be used in retaliation.
Right.
But the problem that we seem to have is that we think that you can use a so-called low-yield nuclear weapon, and that somehow or another the Russians will recognize, oh, that's a small nuclear detonation as opposed to a large one, so the Russians won't respond. And the truth is that if we even are thinking seriously about the use of a tactical nuclear weapon, then we can reckon with a Russian first strike and Armageddon. So that's something that should be off the table. The other point is that I think the Russians have concluded that no one in Kiev is going to negotiate with them, that these decisions are made in Washington and that Washington has no interest in ending the conflict. The Russians have been killing tens of thousands of Ukrainians. It's not reported here, but during these latest offensives down in the south, there were vast caravans of ambulances transporting wounded all the way back to Kiev and further west because all the hospitals are bursting at the seams with Ukrainian wounded.
Wow.
We estimate they're taking at least 20,000 casualties a month.
Oh.
Americans don't know this because the media is not telling them.
Is this civilian and military?
No, this is military.
Military.
I mean, that's
20,000 a month.
Lie. This is, yes.
How can they sustain those numbers? They don't even have that type of troop level, do they?
No, and they can't, and the Russians know that. And the Russians have decided to let the Ukrainians expend themselves on their defenses in these pointless counterattacks. That's what the Soviets did with the Germans in 1943, and it worked so that they could take the offensive later. But the Russians were never interested in crossing the Dnieper River. They weren't interested in annexing all of eastern Ukraine, just those areas that are Russian-speaking that contain Russian citizens, and that's where they're sitting right now.
Right, but Ukraine has been pushed by us, I would assume, the UN, whatever, to advance into those regions and hold them strong, and then as you heard in my buildup, but I'd like your confirmation, possibly then even push into Russia. Is that what we're hearing?
Well, I don't think that's possible. It's
Okay.
possible that you could fire missiles. We could provide the Ukrainians with missiles that could reach Russian territory. I think that would be disastrous. But what he's got going right now is not a full mobilization. It's just a partial mobilization. He's got 300,000 reservists. These are people who've already served in the military. They're being brought back on active duty. They will replace Russian fighting formations in eastern Russia, in northern Russia, that can now be taken and redeployed in Ukraine. And he's also sending reservists to formations in the Russian military that are at about 80 or 75% strength and bringing them up to 100%. But all of this takes time. The Russians are not rushing, though, and this is important to understand, because the winter is coming. The winter is coming, and the winter is going to devastate Europe. Oh, it's going to devastate Europe.
Right.
Germany's economy will probably collapse. Even the German government has admitted this. There's no substitute for the Russian energy.
Right.
Right
Where
now,
are they going to get their oil from? Their natural
firewood.
Gas?
Yeah, well, right now, firewood has become gold in Central East Europe. Think about it.
Well, Colonel, you know I respect the hell out of you, so I'm just going to ask you the final question, a couple seconds left here. What should, in your opinion, if you were there in the halls of the Pentagon and on the Hill advising our elected officials on what to do, on what we should be pushing Ukraine to do, because as you said, we're probably pulling the strings. I mean, we tell Zelensky what we think he should do. Of
course.
Yeah. What should we be doing right now to try to bring this to the end? Because at the end of the day, Colonel, we know who's suffering. The innocent civilians caught in the middle who are also getting killed because nobody wants to talk peace.
Well, that's right. And I think the Russians would be receptive to us because they realize we're in charge. If we said it's time to halt, it's time for a ceasefire, we need to have ceasefire talks and come to some sort of arrangement. And I think the Russians would be receptive to that. Now, how much of the territory are they willing to give up that they hold now? I don't know. But if we don't hold talks now, we don't arrange a ceasefire, they will move on to Odessa, and they will link up with Moldova where they have a Russian state. And at the same time, they will go back north to Kharkov, which was recently abandoned by them, and they will retake it. So it's in our interest, it's in the interest of Ukraine, it's in the interest of Europe to bring this to an end. And we need to turn on the natural gas and the oil.
Yeah, but it sure seems like, Colonel, sure seems like there's some powerful people in the Biden regime, obviously, and in Europe that don't want that to happen. And I think, again, won't speculate reasons why, but I think our viewers are smart enough here to know some of the reasons why they continue this war machine to go on. Colonel Doug Macgregor, as always, a pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dan.
Yep.